I'm Kris Ehler from Ehler Brothers Seed, sales agronomist, and also Soy Envoy for the Illinois Soybean Association. And I have with me today Dr. Ehler and Hager from the University of Illinois, weed scientist. And we're going to pick his brain a little bit on what we've been seeing out in soybean fields in the last couple weeks that have seemed to be getting progressively worse as our drought continues to become progressively worse. Seeing a lot of yellowed, stunted, unhappy soybeans, Dr. Hager. What can you say attributes to these woes?
Well, there's several causes of yellow soybean. Of course, with the dry weather, we can have some issues with adequate nutrient uptake, but unfortunately, most of the field scenarios that I've been involved with in the last 2 to 3 weeks have actually, the yellowing has been caused by carryover of some of the herbicides that were used last year in last year's corn crop. And in particular, there are two classes that seem to be the most common in terms of carryover. One would be the HPPD inhibitors, and the other would be the growth regulator clopyralid. We see damage from both of those groups, and sometimes, depending on what product was used last year, we could actually see it together in the same field.
Yeah, so you got to visit a field that happened to be my father-in-law's, and I got to break the news that it was actually the worst case of clopyralid carryover you had seen. And again, I was in that field and called in some other people because I just couldn't find any pattern that really stood out in that field, other than it all looked really tough.
Yeah, it's many times down through the years when we have seen the carryover, especially of the group 27s or the HPPDs, it's not always evident that there is a pattern. Sometimes it looks like it might have been in an old wet hole, for that kind of a pattern. Occasionally you will find the pattern if you had a double up on the headlands, for example. But generally speaking, a lot of times you'll have, just make up this numbers here, you'll have 10 feet of soybean row that look absolutely fine, and then you've got 2 feet of soybean that are absolutely stunted, and then it goes back for the rest of the row, everything looks fine. So to always find a distinct pattern, it can be a bit of a challenge. But the coloration generally, and then the distorted leaf growth from clopyralid, those two things are fairly easy to identify.
And what would be those characteristics? I know I sent a couple pictures, and I'll try and see if we can attach some pictures with this for the Soybean Association as representation. For example, in that specific field where you saw the almost lanceolate leaf architecture, which typically you don't see till post R2 and the narrowing of the leaves, but these were very narrowed.
For clopyralid, the symptomology will sometimes depend on the route of exposure. So, for example, if we accidentally drifted clopyralid on the soybean, we're going to get a little bit different characteristic effect on the leaf compared with if that plant had been exposed to clopyralid from soil residue. So generally what we would see at this growth stage on soybean from exposure to residue in the soil would be each of the leaflet of the trifoliates tend to be elongated and more tapered. And sometimes if you turn those leaflets over, you can see the veins assuming a more parallel venation than their normal net venation. Now, if we had exposure that had taken place through, say, a drift event, for example, generally speaking, what we see there is actually the margins of the leaves tend to roll inward. It's not the cupping that we associate with dicamba, but rather the margins, the long margins of the leaves tend to roll over along themselves, and almost it can be a little bit more tapered on those affected leaves also. But generally speaking, we generally see a much more tapered effect on the leaves when that plant has been exposed through residues in the soil.
Now let's talk HPPD. That seems to be a little bit more obvious. The nature of the chemistry is a bleacher, and it's pretty evident and obvious when we see that in soybean fields. What are some other symptoms or characteristics of an HPPD type carryover?
The coloration can range anywhere from white tissue to the more common, more widespread at this point, kind of what I refer to, and forgive me for saying it this way, kind of a pukey yellow color. It really, the symptomology that we see is going to be quite a bit dependent upon the dose, how much of that HPPD that particular plant had been exposed to. But generally speaking, what really stands out in most cases would be the yellowing effect that we see either, again, maybe in areas of overlap or, again, a lot of times without a really clear, distinctive pattern in the field.
Yeah, and I think for most growers at this point in the fields that I've walked, it's been a situation where it's clear. It's the overlapping areas. It is the field edges, the boundaries that are showing the HPPD symptomology of carryover. So, and there's a lot of it. Let's talk mechanisms and what influences carryover. I think we all know we just haven't had an abundance of moisture since last year. We got kind of spoon fed into harvest and had a pretty good growing season, given the circumstances of how dry we were going into pollination and post pollination. It was a pretty easy fall from a standpoint of no abundant moisture and somewhat of a dry winter season as well.
Yeah, remember we had a weather front coming through just a couple of days before Christmas last December, and my sister and brother-in-law decided to come a day early to stay with us for the holiday. And I distinctly remember when they arrived, I put gasoline in the snowblower. I never used the snowblower last year. I never even scooped any snow off of our driveway, so we had very little moisture return with snowfall. But actually, the process of carryover, a lot of folks say, well, how much rain did you get after that product was applied? But actually, the process of carryover can even start before that application is made. And by that, I mean it's going to also be dependent to some extent on what was the moisture status of the soil when that application took place. And easiest way to illustrate that is that if you had, let's say, what we'll call decent soil moisture, maybe we had a more normal spring where we were able to get in the field for maybe 3 or 4 days, and we got rained out 2 or 3 days, and that kind of a pattern. If those applications are made when there is, again, decent amount of soil moisture, then a lot of the exchange sites on the colloids in the soil are now occupied by a water molecule. Therefore, the applied herbicide cannot bind to those exchange sites. More of that would remain in solution. It has to be in solution for uptake by plants. It also has to be in solution for degradation by microbial organisms to take place. So the opposite scenario would be if we made an application when the soil had been dry for an extended period of time. Now, more of those exchange sites are not occupied by water. And rather than now, more of that applied herbicide can actually quickly bind to those colloids. And if the soil remains dry for additional days or weeks or even months, then some herbicides can actually bind tighter and tighter over time. Their affinity for those colloids gets stronger and stronger, which means it's going to take more and more moisture ultimately to displace them off. So as you indicated, yes, last year we had a fairly dry year. I think Champaign County was one of the drier counties, certainly here on the east side of the state, if not across the entire state. And so it really was not the fault of anybody making the application. It's just the fact that we started out applying materials to very dry soils, and the soil stayed dry mainly for the rest of the growing season. Very little supply of moisture over the wintertime. Now we couple that with our increasing trend to see more and more soy being planted earlier and earlier in the season, and we simply ran into what we could almost unfortunately refer to as the perfect storm. We just simply did not get enough of that corn herbicide degraded before we put soybeans in the ground, and now we're seeing the outcome of the injury.
Yeah, and even you look at the month of April, it wasn't a situation where growers were out of the field because it was too wet. It was just ultimately too cool, right, for comfort and allowing them to get in and do some planting, and it kind of spread out through the growing season. Great comments on that binding. So So let's say we do switch patterns, and when you hear some meteorologists talking here in the next 10 days to 2 weeks, we're gonna switch patterns and see some moisture on the horizon. What happens then? Or what do you think we could see? Is there a best case scenario or a possible worst case scenario on a amount of precipitation that may swing things to make those soybean plants look worse or better?
Yeah, it's unfortunately it's going to be interesting to have to watch and see how this plays out, because obviously the soybean crop itself is going to require moisture for any of those affected plants to be able to hopefully recover from the injury that they already have sustained. Now, in some instances, we actually have seen an improvement overall for a lot of the affected plants. But one other possible scenario would be precipitation in an amount that actually could displace more of the residue from the soil colloids and therefore make it available for uptake by the crop. In that scenario, one thing that we would have working for us, so to speak, is that now the soybean are much larger than they were when that initial exposure took place. Hopefully there will be enough moisture that it not only remove some of it from the colloids itself, but actually the microbial populations now are certainly very, very active. And the other possible scenario is, even though we may dislodge some additional residues from the colloids, if we had adequate moisture for the microbial population, my guess is they'll probably break that down fairly quickly, given what the soil temperatures are now compared with what they were in the early spring.
So looking on the horizon, if we remain kind of in this pattern of drier, I think the term winter has become extremely mild and lacking precipitation. I think, listening to what you've said just previously, we could be in a very similar situation in 2024.
Oh, definitely. I certainly, encourage people to give these things consideration going into the 2024 season, because a lot of our post applications to our 2023 corn crop were made under fairly dry soil conditions. So as we talked earlier, the whole scenario of carryover actually takes place or begins to take place even before that application is made. Again, what was the moisture status of the soil when that application occurred? For our case right here, we had very similar conditions as what we had last year.
And again,
so this is something that I think we'll have to be very, very aware of moving into the 2024 season.
And again, I think from a grower's perspective, I think we plan on seeing something very similar set up for 2024. So from my standpoint, how do we, work around that, or how can we address it? When we look at the current soybean platforms on the market, you've got your Enlist and your XtendFlex. I think you're going to see some companies come to market with some supply of Liberty Link GT27s. The downfall there is it is a straight Liberty platform. And the only other activity you're going to get there is from what's carrying over in the soil from the HPPD side. But I do believe some of these companies will have some areas that those Liberty Link GT27s could make a serious play into, especially coming out of a seed production field, where typically those HPPDs are used in full amounts. The other side to it is the HT4, where you've got the Liberty Roundup, 2,4-D, dicamba, and HPPD. When we look at that in the horizon, we're anywhere from 6 to 8 years away from that launch. So that's going to take a while to get to market. And again, with everything that's going on, this seems to be a reoccurring theme, unfortunately.
And it will be. And, really it comes down to the chemistry and how it's degraded in the soil. And when you have chemistry that is predominantly degraded by soil microbes, then it really can be impacted under these very dry growing conditions that we have. go back clear back into 1988, very dry summer of 1988. A lot of scepter was actually used in 1988, and in 1989 there was widespread carryover simply because it just did not have the moisture to degrade it in sufficient quantities before the following corn crop was planted. So there's always a potential for these things for products that have residual, and again, if they're impacted by microbial degradation, that under dry scenarios, this is something that we can see. And it's not always just corn to soybean. For example, a fairly common carryover symptom that we see with late applications in dry weather of a soybean herbicide is fomesifin carryover into corn. And it's simply, again, it's something about the timing. It's later into the season. If it turns off dry afterward, if we get in and plant the corn crop timely the following year, it's not uncommon to see that. And we have seen an uptick in that over the last several seasons.
Yeah. And again, you remember the times where that was the product that was used for rescue treatments. And again, that late applied scenario. And again, still in the back of my head was the 2019 wet spring. Everything was applied late. We had somewhat of a dry fall and winter, and 2020 was a textbook lessons for carryover in almost every chemistry that was applied.
And rotational intervals on labels, they're established by the US EPA. They're not really there for concerns about carryover, but they're really established to reduce the possibility of having residue concentration in a non-label crop. But generally speaking, I don't think a company would ever say, okay, we recognize the fact that we can't have extended persistence of this. If the agency only tells us we need 4 months, but yet we know that we could have a carryover scenario, most times these intervals they're not going to be necessarily generous. In other words, they're going to be pretty strict. They're going to be pretty restrictive based on either the residue concern or concern for damage to the rotational crop. So that's, aside from, certain varieties that we may consider next year, we have to pay attention to what these rotational intervals are. Recognize that going into 2024, we have a lot of the same scenarios that are going to play out then as we do have right now. Now, sometimes folks may think about tillage as a way to try to dilute some of the herbicide concentration. Certainly in scenarios we talked about earlier where you see the carryover symptoms predominantly in the overlap areas, that could be something that could help distribute some of that residue around. Is it better to do it in the spring or the fall? I think the jury is probably just out on that really right now. I'm not really sure that there's been any definitive work that shows one time is better than the other time. Something like a field cultivator in the spring of the year, if that's part of your system anyway, certainly I would recommend doing that. Maybe do it early pass, several weeks before planting, try to get the soils warmed up a little bit, and maybe do an additional pass right in front of the planter to either control any weeds that may have emerged, or again, try to distribute some of that residue around in the soil a little bit better.
And that could be one of the scenarios why we don't see a pattern. Again, here in East Central Illinois, tillage is a tool that is utilized on most farms. And if you are in a fall chisel where you're doing some sort of deep rip chisel plow, and then come back in the spring with a field cultivator, you've got 2 tillage passes there, and that movement may move some of those tighter bound soil colloids around just enough that pattern just doesn't show up. For example, like we saw in my father-in-law's field, where again, 3 feet of great looking soybeans followed by 2 feet of terrible looking soybeans in no specific pattern.
And keep in mind, for herbicides, for example, like mesotrione, which is one of the group 27s, persistence gets shorter and shorter at higher pHs. So in other words, if you've got a pH that's, on the low side, and you have used those products, like, for example, like a mesotrione containing product this year, and have very little moisture on it, that may be something where you really give consideration to what do you do next year. Should you even go back and maybe even give up on the idea of soybean and maybe go back on 2-year corn, for example, if that works into your system and your insurance policies and issues like that. So There's a few things that could be done, but really there's really no one solution to the carryover problem. It's simply a matter of time and moisture.
Well, some really great insight today. Greatly appreciate your time. Now, you've got a weed science tour coming up on the 28th of June. Tell us a little bit more about that and how people can participate. And I think that would be something of interest for most growers or retailers to attend. So give us the details on that.
Thank you. Yeah, the University of Illinois Weed Science Field Day will be on Wednesday, June 28th. It's going to be at what we call the Clem Farm. If you go south on First Street past our new farm facility, first stop sign, I believe, is Church Street, and you go about 7/10 of a mile south on First Street. You'll see an open-sided, what we rain exclusion shelter / greenhouse, and you turn left right there, and it's about 3/8 to half a mile back to the east down a gravel and dusty road is where we'll have the majority of our plot work located. What we typically do for each of the treatments that we can show to the public, we put signs in the middle of the plot. It'll give you what the treatment was, what the rates were. We put together a field day book also. Then you can thumb through that for the application dates and timings, etc. We'll have a table in there as you can see when everything was planted, and then when we got each precipitation event. That won't be a very populated page this year, unfortunately. But you could also, we only sign the first replication of each experiment, but in the book, we include all 3 of the replications. So if you want to see how that treatment looked in the second and third reps, you're more than welcome to take a walk through there and check it out for yourself. Registration starts at 7:30. The tour will start at 9. It's only $10, and that helps cover the cost of the lunch that we'll have there a little bit before noon and putting the field day book together for you.
Sounds great. Sounds like a great opportunity again with everything that's going on to reach out with some industry people as well as university folk and get some insight and ideas for moving forward. Well, Dr. Hager, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to share about this topic on carryover and what we're seeing in the soybean fields. So thank you very much for that.